All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Can you hear me okay with the wireless mic? Thumbs up, thank you. My name is Balint Seeber, and I'm the Director of Vulnerability Research at Bastille, where we try to secure the Internet of Things and all things wireless and RF that have a radio in them. In this talk, I'd like to recap some of the hacking that can be done with GNU Radio. Hey Ben, made a start, hope you don't mind. And so if you've seen me speak before, some of this may be familiar to you, but if you're joining us and joining our community, hopefully this will give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the cool and interesting things you can do with software-defined radio and using GNU Radio as the framework and toolkit for doing some hacking. So a couple of things. I'm not going to go into any sort of detail on these. I'm just sort of going to go through and give you a sample. If you do have any more questions after or even during, please feel free to shout it out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about tracking planes, the traffic message channel that's sent out with FM broadcasting, radio direction finding, OP25, which is an open source implementation of the protocol that the police and first responders use to communicate with each other, some IoT waveforms, satellite communications, and rebooting an old satellite. And it's all using GNU Radio. Since I've switched to using Keynote, I put in gratuitous transitions. So feel free to cringe or enjoy as you see fit. So first off, who's actually looked at all the antennas that are sticking out of a plane? There are quite a few, and they do all sorts of different things. Actually, a 747 has 31 radios in total, which makes someone like me very excited. So one of them is ADSB. Who's run some sort of ADSB tracker and tracked planes before? All right, great. It's one of the great apps that you can run with this thing. So as you might know, aircraft transponders will actually broadcast their position, heading, altitude, and squawk code, flight ID, and so on. And so you can use GNU Radio. This is an old decoder that I put together some 4 or 5 years ago. These are actually the packets that are coming out. The AM, it's pulse position modulation, so you can see those spikes there. And where that spike is in time will determine whether you get a 1 or a 0. So you can take that raw packet and then interpret that frame per the spec and then actually put it into this app. This is an app I made a while back that interprets the frames and then will actually plot the planes on a map and show you signal strengths and do tracking and all sorts of stuff. And then, it's fun because as you build up the software and understand how the system works, this is my good friend Matt Robert back in Sydney, Australia, who got me into software-defined radio. We would go up onto the hill there by the airport, take all our gear with us and work into the middle of the night and track all the planes and collect data and stuff. It was good fun. But it's nice because then you can begin reviewing your data, and this is the Bay Area now on the West Coast, and you can see planes landing and taking off, and the altitude trails are, the flight trails are color-coded by altitude, so you can see them descending and taking off there at the 3 major airports in the Bay Area. Quite a bit of traffic. That's a bad transponder there, spewing out data that doesn't quite meet the spec, so you get this colorful rainbow effect, and you have congestion showing up in slightly altered flight routes. And you can see the evidence of the main airports there, the active runways. And what's also nice, for example, is you can actually watch their flights taking off or landing. This is zoomed into SFO. There's a Virgin flight taking off there. It was filming it at the same time, and you can see that it's about to rotate. When the nose gear lifts off the tire, it flips a bit, and that'll turn from red to green, which means that it's actually airborne. There it goes green. And it's cool because you can watch the velocity of the aircraft seriously increasing as the jets push it up into the sky. As it climbs, you can zoom out, and you see it's following a trail that was taken by an aircraft that just took off prior. And then watch out, something's coming in, but luckily it's a lot higher altitude, so that's all right. And what's nice is that because you have latitude, longitude, and altitude, you can then plot it in 3D. So it's the same system, but it's streaming through to Google Earth. I had this system running in Sydney and hoping to one day bring it back for the Bay Area, but this was just a test I did there. Same deal, but this is in Google Earth now. Same scenario. There's actually a plane there coming into land at Oakland. And what's really nice is then you can do a virtual cockpit view. So you can pretend to be the pilot flying the plane that just took off and see what it might look like like a little flight sim. And it's kind of neat because you take off and then you swing around and you get a beautiful view of the Google Earth 3D rendered bay as you swing around to see San Francisco in all its 3D glory there. Another system there, I've got audio. Could I have a bit of audio on the laptop output? There we go. So that's actually ACARS. Who's heard of ACARS or decoded ACARS messages? Oh, that's fantastic. Why is it everyone on this side of the room? What's different between the two sides of the room? So ACARS is the Aircraft Communication Reporting System. It's like text messaging, but for aircraft avionics systems. And there are a bunch of different channels that are used. This is a decoder that will interpret them and spit out the message. Often they're human readable. And the system would then fuse the transponder information with the ACARS messages and actually bring them together onto the same map. So this is Sydney now. You can see the trails, but every time you see a balloon pop up, it leaves a little dot behind, and that balloon contains the content of the ACARS message. So you can be listening on these two independent systems and fuse them together and get much more interesting information about, in this case, flights going on and what they're sending, and we're talking things like performance reports from engines, messages to and from the cockpit, and so on. And those thicker white lines are actually the waypoints that are being sent in flight plans to the aircraft. And if you care to join me for my talk tomorrow, I'm going to talk about doing exactly the same thing, but from a satellite. And then, if you've seen this before, please don't cringe that I'm going to use the joke again, but I noticed there are a lot of messages regarding clogging of toilets, so I added an Easter egg about that particular message on the aircraft. And it's cool because when you get the waypoints, you can plot them and you can see long-haul flights going into Asia and across the other side of Australia and so on. Actually, I just rendered out some information I got from a satellite that does this waypoint stuff, and if you come tomorrow, then it actually covers all of the globe. It looks really cool. But that's that. Switching gears now, who's got a nav system in their car where it actually shows you the traffic, the live traffic, so you have tells you which roads are congested and so on. So the way that works is if you use something like GRRDS, you can listen to the audio, but it also will decode the RDS subcarrier there, so you get the station name and the song name and so on. But part of that is also you see here that it's telling you about there's a particular location and then there's a particular segment that's congested and traffic is flowing at 40 kilometers an hour instead of however fast it should. And that gets interpreted by your car radio system into something like this. So you've got the map, it's indicating there's a bit of congestion there and there's roadworks there and so on. That's all sent over the system, and I wanted to look into how that works, so I did a bit of research. Turned out that although they send you the messages in the clear, the location codes are actually encrypted, and they send out every so often the daily ID for the encryption key. But again, if you want to sort of investigate how a system is working and how secure it is, I went on a little bit of an expedition here, and the keys aren't very long, and the search space is small-ish, and so you can create an intelligent search algorithm to go through and begin eliminating keys that don't work, and then whittle it right down after a long time of observation, exploiting some repeating patterns that sort of occur with certain messages. And as you can see, you actually can, for each encryption key ID, whittle the potential keys down to a very, very small number. And with a bit more observation, you could actually begin recovering them. So an example of a system that, they didn't really secure it, especially with the sort of analysis and hardware that's possible these days. Another cool thing about system, and I don't know if you've tried it, but GRRDS is also capable of transmitting. So this is the display in my car. This is a very unique radio station that might have temporarily been broadcasting something. So good fun. Another system is radio direction finding. The idea here is no longer to actually listen to what's contained in your signal, but an attempt to figure out where the signal's coming from. And actually, if you go over to the EDIS booth, there's a really nice little demo where you have essentially an RF wand, and it'll tell you the angle that signal is emanating from. But this is when I tried to sort of muck around with it initially back in Sydney many years ago. I put this very experimental antenna array suction capped onto the top of my car roof, had that going into a USOP1 there through an antenna switch, and this would actually switch through the antennas really, really quickly and use a Doppler approach in an attempt to discover the direction of the wavefront. And then with a little bit of software, you can drive around, hook it up to GPS, and then take samples of the directions, and eventually they'll all converge on the red X where I knew the transmitter was. So, fairly simple setup. This technique is pretty rudimentary compared to sort of more modern techniques you can use. But the interesting thing here is that you're not actually interested in what the signal is, you're interested in where it's coming from. So it's another way to sort of look at the signal. And again, this is sort of a live demo. You can drive around. I tuned into some transmitter, and it was, I think, way down there. Obviously, you can see that more often than not, it's pointing down there. Interestingly, it flips around. And it's an example of an effect in the real world that you have to consider outside of just your simulations, where you have multipaths. So a signal will take multiple paths to reach your antenna. It might be direct, it might bounce off buildings and so on. And as they all constructively or destructively interfere at your receiver, they will change the measurements. That's why it moves around a little bit or goes completely off. So, there's, again, that leap of going from your simulation or your lab environment to the real world. So another one I mentioned was OP25, and this is a system, if you've seen police or first responders or anyone with the large walkie-talkies, like the Motorola ones. Who's seen the Motorola XTS radios? Yeah, quite a few of you. So they're capable of, in this case, P25, Project 25. DMR is the newest standard that's coming out and sort of surpassing this one, but this is still very popular. And there's an open source project, the OP25, that looks at implementing this. And my friend Matt Robert, actually, who worked on this too, has a flow graph. You can launch it. He keys up on his radio. So he recorded that sample for me. And I enhanced this a little bit so that you could supply it with a crypto key if you knew the crypto key for your transmission. So this transmission's been sent in the clear. And you can hear that it's kind of synthetic because it's a digital data stream. It's not actually just analog voice. That analog voice that's entering the radio is being encoded via vocoder, and then that digital data is being sent over the air, comes to your receiver, that grabs the data, does error correction and so on, and then turns it back into analog audio. So we could hear that, and it dumps the raw frames so you can look for patterns and so on. But if you were to actually transmit something encrypted, it would sound like this. This is when there's no key set in the system. So the reason why it sounds like that is because, you're kidding, right? I'm going to ignore that for at least 5 minutes. The reason why that doesn't work is because you're basically generating a key stream that doesn't match the key stream that was used to encode the original data. And if you set it, the key's been set, and the algorithm here says it's des OFB. It's producing the correct key stream, and then out of this encrypted stream, you're getting a legit audio. So in that case, we knew what it was. There's a lot of interesting research done around the security, or rather insecurity, of this particular encryption scheme for OP25. So check it out. Another one is IoT protocols. So Z-Wave is an interesting one used in home automation. Comes in a bunch of different rates. I thought recently, well, I'll just put together a flow graph to actually receive these packets, because the modulation scheme is pretty straightforward. Yeah, don't worry about that. And so I was at ShmooCon, and some people were doing some demonstrations with some Z-Wave stuff. And so I just had it running there while they were doing their demo and sniffing all these packets. And in DC then at 2 a.m. I got a lift, and I rode around DC with a B200 Mini hanging out the window, plus some other stuff, sniffing Z-Wave around the whole city. It was really funny when the Lyft driver was approaching the White House. You know how they have the police cars around there? And he quickly took a turn. It's probably a good idea. But it wasn't anything sus, so it was all right. The other one is LoRa. My colleague Matt Knight's going to talk about this on Thursday, I believe, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here. But this is a really interesting modulation scheme, which is chirp spread spectrum. It looks quite odd on your spectrum. And initially, before we looked at it, I just used a quick flow graph to de-chirp it. And you can see that the normal spectrum looks like that. You can't see much. But as soon as you de-chirp it, you immediately get some patterns and data coming out. So other thing you can do, just to wrap up, second last thing is listen to satellites. If you get a dish and a USERP and a low noise block down converter, this is the telemetry signal coming off one of the satellites that orbits above Australia that delivers TV and a whole bunch of other things. You can decode that and create a raster plot and actually look for patterns in there. You can see it's all very structured, so you know what the stride of your frame is. If you get these triangles, that's indicative of counters in the frame that are increasing. I picked a particular channel, and you can do some what's called blind signal analysis and do some DSP tricks and actually then recover the data that's being transmitted, even though you know nothing about it. So it takes a while because you've got to try all sorts of combinations of things. I got all this weird data out and thought, what happens if you plot it? I had no idea what it was, and I got some pretty plots. So, and then to finish off, promised last thing, this is, so who heard of the ISE-3 reboot mission? A couple of you? So this was an old NASA space probe that got sent out in 1978. It was designed to do solar science. And it was also repurposed to be the first to pass through a comet and beat other countries that were attempting to do the same thing. They created this incredible orbit to go around the L1 Lagrange point for a while and then go out and meet the comet. I'll skip the video. It had a bunch of science instruments on board, plus a 2 gigahertz S-band radio and all sorts of thrusters. This was the old NASA telemetry screen. And some amateur radio astronomers discovered its signal as it was coming back to do its latest lunar flyby in 2014. So it was actually still on and active after all this time. The idea was to fire the thrusters and bring it back into orbit around the Earth after 30 years and open it up for citizen science. We did some calculations, and they discovered that there was just enough fuel before a particular date there to fire it, to bring it back. At the time we started working on it, it was 15 million kilometers away, moving toward the Earth at 3.4 kilometers per second, very fast. We went to Arecibo, the big radio telescope you might remember from movies such as Contact and Goldeneye, and pretty amazing place. At the time, I was with Edis Research, and we hooked up the N210s to their big IF panel. We found the satellite. It's actually slanted there because of the Doppler effect as it's moving toward the Earth and the Earth is rotating. And then we fixed the pointing, so we got much better lock on the target. We put another USERP in there to actually transmit out of Arecibo back to the bird, because Arecibo's got ridiculous gain. So we were all prepped to go. We sent the commands out, was verifying that they were going out, because this is just, I'm receiving on a B200 here with an antenna, the energy that's being transmitted from the dish, just to make sure that it is actually going out, because I think one time somebody forgot to plug something in and it wasn't working. So it's a good way to test. We sent our signal out, hoping it would hit the space probe. It did. That was my partner in crime, Austin Epps, the lead engineer on that project. And suddenly the carrier became modulated now with the telemetry coming down from the bird, so we could figure out what was going on. Much rejoicing. This is what it sounds like. That's the telemetry data coming down. This is a GNU radio program to actually receive it and lock on, and it would then go into a separate program that would demodulate it, decode it, show us the information about the thruster system so that we could prepare to fire the thrusters. We had many of our friends in Germany listening as well, back at the repurposed McDonald's or NASA Air Force Base, where we had our mission control. We were all preparing, all my colleagues on that mission. This is actually looking at the live telemetry coming down from that system. We tried to fire the thrusters. It didn't work. This is the accelerometer data. We should have seen all these pulses coming out. Unfortunately, the hydrazine propulsion system ran out of nitrogen pressure in the tanks, which was supposed to push the fuel out. So over 30 years, although there was hydrazine on board, the gas to push it to the catalyst beds, actually, probably our theory is escaped. So we couldn't do that, so it went out into orbit again. We got a bit of science from it because we actually turned some of the instruments back on. If you want to learn more, spacecraftforall.com. And that's the team outside the McDonald's. And this is another cool project. Tim Keister hacked the protocol for the dog trainers, you know, that do the shocking. So at Cyberspectrum last year, he demonstrated it. Because he had it around his ankle. So it works. So thank you. If you've got any more detailed questions, please feel free to ask later.
All right, let's thank our speaker. Thank you, Balint. I'm sorry.